The Nile did not begin in any one place, not really. Its waters may have trickled down from the highlands of Ethiopia, or from the leafy depths of equatorial lakes, but its story didn't start in the mountains. It began with a sound, not a roar or a rush, but something gentler. A sigh, a hush of wind through papyrus reeds, a soft swirl of silt in a fisherman's pail, the lapping murmur of water brushing against the sides of a clay boat at dawn. To the people who lived along its long, patient spine, the Nile was not a river. It was breath. It was song. It was an old lullaby sung through centuries, winding and unwinding like a sleeping serpent through golden land in the dark hush before sunrise. When the desert still clung to its coolness and stars lingered in the sky, the Nile whispered its oldest stories. The wind rustled through the date palms and bulrushes, brushing against bare ankles of early risers fishermen casting nets with slow, practiced movements. Reed cutters, harvesting silence and stalks. Children collecting water, their clay jugs, cool against their chests. There was no hurry in the Nile. Even time seemed to move more slowly where its waters passed. The river's surface rippled like old linen, creased and folded by stories. Its currents weren't just water, but memory. The scent of blue lotus floated thick in the air, sweet, heavy, just on the edge of too much. It perfumed the breeze that drifted through open windows and village courtyards, carried by the river's breath. Women would rise with the sun to crush lotus petals for perfume or float them in bowls of water. In temples and homes alike, the scent became a kind of sacred hush, a pause in the morning that reminded everyone the river was awake. The Nile divided the land, yes, but only so it could gather people along its edges. To the east, the sun climbed the sky with ceremonial grace. To the west, the land of the dead slumbered beneath sand and tomb. But in between, always in between, life pulsed like the river's heartbeat. Along the floodplain, wheat and barley stood in polite green rows, their stalks swaying as if in prayer. Mud-brick villagers leaned into the shoreline, humble and content. Cattle lowed, sandals slapped, and voices called greetings from one rooftop to another. But beneath it all was the Nile. It was always the Nile. To live beside it was to listen, even when you didn't mean to. It had 1,000 voices, some soft, some insistent. It chuckled around stones and gurgled against the wooden oars of passing traders. It murmured at night, coaxing infants to sleep in swaddled baskets. Some said the river could speak if you stayed very still, not in words, but in impressions, like someone touching your shoulder and then disappearing. Children whispered that the river had moods, that on certain nights it dreamed of things too old for men to remember, that it would shimmer like silver when pleased, or pull your sandal from your foot when it was bored. There were tales of spirits who lived in the Nile, Reed's good ones who protected the boats, and mischief makers who hid frogs in your water jar. Even grown men, when drunk on beer and story, might lower their voices and say, "The river sees more than we do." It was not a god, exactly, not like Ra or Isis, but it was something closer cousin to divinity, perhaps, a breath between gods. In the old days, before the first stone had ever been carved into a pyramid, the people along the Nile told stories of a watery mother who birthed the first lands. In Nubia, it was said that the river flowed from the tears of a goddess. In Upper Egypt, fishermen swore they'd seen a boy with a blue crown rising from the current, smiling before disappearing again. The Nile had no beginning in those stories. It had always been, and it would always be, Even the earliest myths felt like dreams half remembered. They were told, not with urgency, but with the slowness of someone wrapping cloth around a delicate thing. One tale said that the river first appeared when a heron walked across the empty land and called out a single note, low and long. From that cry, the water sprang up and stretched into the horizon. Another spoke of a lonely child who, looking for his mother, wept for so long that his tears filled the land and called forth papyrus and hippos and crocodiles. The myths didn't argue with one another. There was no need to be right when the river was so patient. It carried all stories, like boats drifting side by side. Travelers from distant lands would arrive at the Nile's banks and try to describe it. They'd use words like great, mighty, or fertile, but the locals would just smile. You couldn't explain the Nile. You lived with it. You watched it rise in late summer, spilling out over the fields with regal certainty. You planted when it receded, thanked it when the grains grew tall, and listened when the frogs began to sing at dusk. The Nile gave rhythm to the year it marked, the start of the flood season a kit, when the waters swallowed the boundaries of field and road. It was a time of waiting and trusting. Then came Pare, the growing season, and finally Shemu, the harvest. The river's breath guided all things, the pulse of labor, the whispers of priests, the quiet prayers of mothers who hoped their sons wouldn't be taken by crocodiles or conscripted into Pharaoh's armies. Even in sleep, the river was present. It hummed beneath dreams. Older villagers swore they could hear ancestors calling from the water's edge, their voices threaded into the current like silverfish. Some left bowls of beer at the shore in thanks. Others floated bread on palm leaf trays, watching as the offerings drifted into the night. There were dangers, of course. The Nile could drown as easily as it gave. It held secrets, dead kings and fallen boats and things not meant to be named. But it was never cruel. It simply was. Like the sky, like breath, in the small hours before dawn, the stars faded. A single fisherman knelt at the edge of the water, his net coiled neatly beside him. He whispered something, not a prayer, not exactly, just a greeting. The way one might speak to an old friend you see every day. The river responded with a ripple, as if shrugging. The fisherman smiled and cast his net. The water caught the light of the first sunbeam and shimmered like a sheet of gold thread. On the opposite bank, a heron lifted into the air, its wings silent. Somewhere nearby, a woman hummed while grinding grain. A child coughed in his sleep, and the river whispered on, not a beginning, just a continuation, a lullaby remembered, a breath. Inhaled, the Nile had spoken, and the world, lulled by its rhythm, listened. The Nile had many voices. Some were loud like the slap of oars against water or the cries of ibis startled from the reeds. But some were soft, and those soft voices belonged to people like Isit. She lived in Thebes, not in the grand heart of the temples or near the painted tombs of nobles, but farther out, where the water slowed, and the houses were made of mud brick, and the scent of wet flax clung to the air like a veil. Isit was one of the linen workers, not noble, not poor, not free of labor, but not enslaved either. She belonged to that wide and uncelebrated class of working women who held Egypt together with every spindle and thread. Her fingers were always busy. Even in dreams, she imagined herself spinning, in the cool morning hours before the sun cast. Its heavy gaze across the fields, she would walk barefoot to the river's edge. Her feet knew the path by memory down past the barley fields, past the gossiping washerwomen and the silent, waiting ibis. She carried a shallow basket on her head. Inside it, bundles of retted flax and a small pot of beeswax to help soften the stubborn fibers. The Nile water was low that month. She stepped into it anyway, lifting her linen hem and ignoring the cold. The river welcomed her like it welcomed everyone without question or judgment. For the weavers, the Nile was not just the place to soak flax. It was where they came to think, to cool their aching arms, to rinse out the sweat and heat of a long morning's work. It knelt, dipping the bundles of flax into the water. The smell of the river was old and green and earthy like time itself exhaled from the reeds. She had been doing this since she was a girl, learning from her mother, who learned from hers. Linen didn't just clothe Egypt, it wrapped the dead. Shrouded statues, padded sandals, even lined temple walls. And someone had to make it someone with patience, slender fingers, and a strong back. She watched the fibers loosen and soften in the current. Some floated away. She didn't mind. That was the way of things some thread always lost to the river. The god Hopi, they said, took a small offering from every craft. When the bundles were ready, she carried them home, humming to herself. The sun rose higher now, making her tunic stick to her back. The smell of roasting onions and lentils wafted from a neighbor's house. Cats stretched in doorways, flies hummed near fig sellers, and children drew nonsense in the dust with papyrus. Stems at home, she joined her sister and mother in their shaded courtyard. The women sat cross-legged on mats, each with a spindle or a comb. Their voices were low. Sometimes they sang, sometimes they recited half-remembered poems or old market jokes. Isit worked with a spindle first, twisting the fibers into thread. Her fingers never paused. She had learned the rhythm of spinning from watching birds, the way they tilted, balanced, corrected. A good spinner needed to understand movement, not just material. Later, she moved on to weaving. Her loom was simple, but tall, a vertical frame with evenly spaced warp threads and a weighted bar at the bottom. She passed the weft thread over and under, again and again, tapping it down with a carved bone comb. Linen weaving in Egypt was not just domestic work, it was an industry. The finest linen came from places like Thebes. Temple workshops, palace stores, and traveling traders all prized the crisp white cloth that glowed like moonlight in torchlight. And while the men did the trading and wore the headdresses, it was the women like Isit who wove the very fabric of the kingdom. As she worked, her thoughts wandered. She imagined perfumes. She had smelled them once at the festival of Opet, when a noblewoman had walked past wearing blue lotus oil. The scent had stopped Isit mid-step. It was thick, warm, floral-like, a dream blooming inside her nose. Too expensive, of course. She could trade a month's work for a thimble of it and still come up short. But dreams didn't care for coin. She wove and dreamed, combed and tied off loose threads. Around her, life carried on. Chickens chased insects. A boy tripped over. A pot, someone sneezed into a basket of garlic. Nothing grand, nothing poetic. But in this small life, there was order, rhythm, and purpose. Linen didn't speak, but it remembered. And Isit's fingers wrote her life into every thread at market. She traded her bolts of cloth with a merchant named Kebi. He was older, kind-eyed, with a laugh that puffed his cheeks. He liked her work, said it was tight-woven, even, reliable. He didn't flirt, didn't haggle too cruelly. He paid in grain, oil, or copper pins, depending on what he could spare. The marketplace buzzed like a beehive in summer. Traders shouted beneath woven awnings, donkeys brayed, someone argued over the price of dates. The air smelled of dust, sweat, honey cakes, and smoke. Is it never lingered to many men's eyes? Too much noise, but she liked seeing what the city whispered when no priest was watching. Here, one could learn the price of fish and the gossip of temple dancers in the same breath. At the edge of the market stood a statue of the goddess Neith, patroness of weaving and war. Is it always paused before her? The statue's face was worn by wind and kisses of passing hands, but her presence remained quiet, sturdy, female. Isid did not pray aloud. She simply stood there, letting her breath steady. The goddess understood. She had woven the world, they said, thread by thread, just as Isid did every day. Sometimes, during festival nights, when the streets filled with music and painted masks, Isid would sneak out with her sister. They would stand on rooftops, barefoot and giggling, watching the boats. Lit with torches drift by the river, the city shimmered. Drums beat softly in the distance. Perfumed smoke curled into the dark like whispered laughter. And sometimes, just sometimes, a stranger might offer her a lotus. She would refuse, smile, and return home. Not because she was uninterested, but because she understood that longing, like linen, must be twisted and tempered before it held. Years passed. Threads piled up. Some days, her hands ached so badly she had to soak them in warm sand. But she never stopped weaving. Each bolt of linen was a quiet defiance against forgetting, a whisper to the future, a promise that even those without tombs or titles still mattered. And when she died quietly, after a long afternoon of carding flax, her family wrapped her in linen she had made herself. The Nile, soft and low, hummed in the distance, and somewhere, perhaps in a tomb far from her reach, a nobleman still wore a robe she had woven. Thread by thread, her hands left behind a map of invisible labor, and the river remembered, because the Nile always remembered the hands that touched its water in silence. The boy rose before the ibis stirred in the quiet blue hours before the sky turned gold. He was already awake, toes brushing the damp mud of the riverbank. His name was Panifer, though most people simply called him Lotus Boy. At 10 years old, he had not yet grown into the long shadows of the priests or the commanding stillness of the scribes. But he had strong arms for rowing, a quiet presence that pleased the gods, and the kind of soft, listening patience that made blue lotus open in his hands like they did for no one else. His work was simple. Every morning, Panifer ferried baskets, a freshly picked blue lotus upstream to the temple gardens and shrines along the river's slow current. The flowers were not for sale. These were temple lotuses offering blooms, sacred and sleepy, meant for incense bowls and priestly fingers, for dream visions and the lidded eyes of statues. Some said the lotus opened the mind to the gods. Others said it simply made one forget. The weight of dust and toil, Panifer didn't know what to believe. He liked the flowers for the way they floated gently on the water's skin, as if they belonged more to dreams than to the world of sandals and sunburns. That morning, as every morning, the river whispered under his boat. His reed canoe was patched and uneven. A hand made down from his older brother who now delivered dates instead of flowers. Panifer loaded his wide, shallow baskets, carefully never stacking the lotus too high, never letting the blooms bruise one another. The petals were delicate, and the temple women, who knew every fault in every flower, would reject any that looked wilted or crumpled. A blue lotus, must be perfect hope in just enough, like a yawn in slow motion, as he pushed off from the muddy bank. The breeze carried with it the scent of night, fading damp reeds, crushed lily leaves, distant bread ovens coming to life. His oar stirred the hush of the river. Each pull was slow and sure, and the canoe slid forward without sound. Even the birds were quiet. The herons watched him from the papyrus thickets with one-legged stillness, and the frogs, sensing his passage, simply blinked and let him glide by. Blue Lotus was more than beautiful. It was sacred. Its scientific name Nympha would not be known for millennia, but its spirit had been whispered for thousands of years. In temple murals, the gods often held the lotus in one hand, like a fragrant torch. In myths, the flower rose from the primal waters of none the endless, inky nothingness before creation unfolding to birth the sun itself. Some said it helped the soul rise. Others said it made sleep more beautiful. Priests would steep the petals in wine for dream rituals, and sleepy offerings would be made before statues of Osiris and Ra. The flowers arranged in bowls of alabaster and bronze, their perfume curling upward like a prayer. When important people died, lotus buds were tucked beside them, soft companions in the darkness. And in everyday life, girls wore them in their hair, and poets described kisses that tasted like the blue flower blooming. Panafer knew none of this in words, but he felt it. The reverence in how temple hands received his cargo, the careful hush with which the priests took the flowers, never touching the petals too firmly, always bowing a little, even if only with the chin. He understood that this flower was not a market good. It was not a spice. It was not meat. It was something else, a sleeper's offering. His mother used to place one beside her bed on the hottest nights of the flood season, not to pray, just to smell. It cools the mind, she once told him. The gods left their breath in it. The boy's route was always the same. He passed the fisherman with no teeth, who was always mending the same net, whether it needed mending or not. He passed the house with the 3 crooked stairs, where the old goat slept nose-tuners with its owner. He passed the stone lions guarding the entrance to a ruined shrine that no one entered anymore, though someone still left oil lamps burning near the threshold. Every so often, another boat would pass, mostly silent, mostly slow. Boats of barley, boats of scribes, boats of women carrying baskets of woven grass. He nodded to each, but rarely spoke. The morning was too soft for voices today. As the sun slid over the eastern horizon like a cautious beetle, he saw the first golden glint on the water's surface. It touched the tips of his lotus flowers, making them shimmer like painted dreams. Panafer looked down at the basket beside him and thought they looked like little boats themselves, petaled rafts drifting on green stems. He thought of the temple of Khnum, stood near the bend where the river curled like a sleeping cat's tail. Its walls were old, but smelled of myrrh and lemon oil. White-robed priests, blinking from sleep, would be waiting already, lining up incense, already polishing copper bowls. The women who swept the floors and kept track of the offerings would be sipping sweet beer and yawning into the crooks of their elbows. And, if he was lucky, Panafer might catch sight of the girl with the tilted laugh who always overpaid him with extra bread. But before the temple came the reeds. He always stopped there, not out of duty but out of rhythm. The reeds along the western bank grew tall and thick, where the water slowed into small inlets. There, the river became glassy, and the lotuses grew wild. He often left a few moments aside to simply float. Among them, this was the secret place, A place without words. A place where the blue lotus swam freely, not bound by baskets or prayers or trade. Today, he let his canoe drift into the edge of the inlet. The lotuses here were wider, deeper in color. Some were just buds, like sleeping birds. Others were fully open, their golden hearts rising toward the light. Fish flickered below, dragonflies skimmed above, and Panifer simply sat, hands resting on the side of the boat, letting the scent wrap around him like cloth. He closed his eyes. The river whispered old stories here, not the kind that scribes wrote on papyrus, the kind that came with the wind, with the water slipping through reeds, with the way a lotus opens when no one is looking. He imagined just once, that the river spoke to him, not in words, but in presence, in the feeling that something was watching with ancient patience, something older than priests or kings, something that remembered every petal dropped in offering, every drowned prayer, every forgotten song. Perhaps the river did remember. Perhaps it listened, even now, at the temple. The priests welcomed him with the usual nods. They always said the same thing, "Good blooms today, boy." And Panifer would nod. He never answered unless asked. The women sorted the flowers, selecting some for the god, others for the garden, a few for the visitors' quarters. One older priest, who had once studied in Memphis, always picked a blossom to place behind his ear, muttering something about how it reminded him of a childhood garden that may or may not have existed. Today, the girl with the tilted laugh was there. She handed Panifer a piece of flatbread with crushed dates in it. "You smell like river," she teased. "Or maybe the river smells like you." Panifer smiled but said nothing. He was already thinking of the inlet, of the way the blue lotus waited quietly for no one, blooming whether people watched or not, of how the river never hurried. When he paddled back downstream, the sun was brighter, the wind warmer. The other boats were faster now, and the air buzzed with the rising hum of day. But in his canoe, among the faint perfume of lotus and the hush of morning memories, it still felt like the world was half asleep. Panifer didn't mind. He liked it better that way. Let the world wake up slowly. The flowers would still bloom. The gods would still listen, and the river would still whisper, just as it always had. The sun was always a little gentler just after dawn, especially along the shaded corridor that led to the inner sanctum of the temple library in Esna. The columns still held on to the coolness of the night, their painted lotus capitals sweating. Tiny beads of dew, sand stuck to the sandals of the first librarian to arrive, an older scribe with a crooked back and a soft, thoughtful face worn down by years of squinting at papyrus. He didn't speak as he entered. No one ever did, not really. Words were for the page. The temple library was a sanctuary not just for scrolls, but for silence itself. At the center of the room stood rows of low stone shelves, filled with scrolls, rolled tide, labeled in neat ink, some still drying from the day before. The papyri smelled faintly of river reeds, beeswax, and something ancient, like forgotten incense. The shelves weren't as organized as modern minds might hope. Nothing alphabetized, nothing numbered. A scroll about barley taxation might rest beside a hymn to Thoth, or a personal letter from a priest to his grandmother. The walls, carved with protective spells, whispered nothing at all. It was the kind of quiet that made a person forget time existed. Scribes of the sacred and the boring the librarians of the temple were not grand priests, nor especially revered prophets. They were usually second sons, apprentice scribes, or retired temple recorders. those who had once copied names into birth rolls or transcribed court proceedings. Their hands moved automatically now, used to the smooth rhythm of brush to papyrus. Each morning began the same, wiping off yesterday's sand, carefully unrolling a half-finished scroll, and dipping the reed brush into diluted black ink made of soot, gum, and water. Sometimes red ink was used, but only for names or omens. They recorded things no one would ever recite in ceremonies: the number of fish caught in sacred ponds, the monthly grain rations for workers, the dreams of junior priests, the complaints of neighbors, and on one particularly humid day a list of every chicken in the village that had mysteriously refused to lay eggs. It was the most mundane magic in Egypt. Bureaucracy, the calendar of sleepy moons, one scroll. The boy scribes often practiced. Copying was called the calendar of auspicious days. It was not a list of grand feasts or great battles, but a sleepy record of when to do things like cut your hair, plant onions, or avoid arguments. Each day was judged either good, bad, or extremely unlucky. Do not go outside, one entry read, for the west wind will bring confusion and spilled ink. On another, do not eat lentils today, the moon is watching. These calendars were copied over and over, partly to train the hand, but also to give direction to those who believed the stars noticed everything. The scribes didn't always believe in the superstitions, but copying them felt respectful, like tracing the thoughts of ancestors in the margins of some older calendars. One might find sleepy doodles, a cat curled beside a pot of ink, a fly with wings far too big, or a yawning lion with comically round eyes. These weren't part of the official record, of course, but no one ever erased them. The dream record room to the left of the main library, past a narrow doorway half hidden by a curtain of linen threads, was a room reserved for dream reports. Each night, a small number of priests slept in the temple's inner sanctum, hoping to receive visions or messages from the gods. These were called incubation dreams. In the morning, they dictated what they remembered to a dream scribe, usually a young boy still learning to write. The scribes listened patiently to stories that made very little sense. I saw a crocodile wearing a crown of onions. I spoke to my grandfather. He asked why I had stopped singing. I floated down the Nile on a bed made of fish bones. A falcon told me to eat fewer figs. No one judged these dreams. They were recorded faithfully, then placed into the archive of the temple, just in case they held hidden wisdom. Most never did. Still, the scrolls grew. Decades of dreams, centuries of sacred sleep. The fly-swatting Pausiven, the most diligent scribe, had to pause now and then, especially in summer, when the flies buzzed with the laziness of heat. There were no windows, only high vents that let in shafts of light and the occasional wasp. One scribe, Senmit, his name appears on the corner of many scrolls, was known for using his reed brush as both pen and fly swat. Occasionally, the ink on his work was smudged by a sudden slap, and once a fly landed mid-sentence, leaving a tiny dark footprint across a line about the phases of the moon. No one corrected it. Lunch was taken in silence. Flatbread, dates, sometimes salted fish wrapped in cloth. Scribes sat cross-legged among the columns, nibbling slowly, watching the dust float like smoke in the golden light. One or two might sip weak wine and let their eyes close for a moment, lulled by the rhythm of papyrus rustling and birds cooing in the rooftop rafters. What they wrote and what they meant to the outside world, temple librarians were dull men with. dull jobs, endlessly recording dull things. But inside those quiet halls, they believed something else. They believed the scrolls carried breath, that a name written in ink was safer than one spoken aloud, that bureaucracy was a net that held together a civilization. A well-recorded temple inventory was as sacred as a hymn, and a dream told by a frightened acolyte deserved the same care as a royal decree. One scroll, found in fragments centuries later, included only a single line repeated 4 pages. To remember a name is to defy death. Maybe it was practice, maybe it was poetry, maybe it was the only line the scribe knew how to write at the time, but it remains, centuries later, on brittle papyrus, now resting in a museum drawer. Still whispering. The afternoon quiet. By afternoon, the temple library grew warm. Even the stone began to sweat. Scribes returned to their scrolls, slower now. Brushes dragged more lazily. Yawns were suppressed out of respect, though not always successfully. Occasionally, someone would hum quietly, tunelessly, a lullaby for the ink. And then, when the sun began to tilt and the blue of the Nile shifted toward gold, they packed up. Brushes rinsed, scrolls tied, sand brushed off knees. The final act of the day was always the same, a silent bow to Thoth, the god of writing. Outside, the sounds of the temple resumed: chants, bells, the thump of sandals on stone. But inside the library, the silence lingered, like the final exhale of a dream not yet forgotten. In the end, it was not the grandeur of statues or the roar of battles that preserved Egypt through millennia. It was the scribes, quiet men in quiet rooms, recording what no one else thought to keep: a spilled grain count, a list of lunar birthdays, a dream about a talking hippo, and the exact number of priests who forgot their sandals during the festival of flood. The temple library did not sleep. It whispered, and the Nile, outside, kept flowing slow and eternal, carrying those whispers downstream toward memory. By the time the sun has barely begun to lift its golden hand over the eastern bank of the Nile, the elderly priest of the Sobek shrine is already awake. His name is Menu, though no one says it aloud in the shrine's hush. To the others, sweepers, and the sleepy-eyed boy who brings bread, he is simply Netcher Hedet, servant of peace. Not because he is especially calm, though he is, but because his work, by its nature, must be done in silence. You would not expect much to happen in a crocodile shrine. You might picture roaring beasts or theatrical rites with teeth and blood. But the truth is far sleepier. The shrine of Sobek, nestled beside a quiet canal near the Fayum basin, smells mostly of old limestone and river mud, sometimes incense, sometimes old wine, sometimes just the warm dust that collects in cracks between crocodile toes carved in stone. Menu begins each morning with water, always water. Not the Nile's murky swirls, those are sacred and kept for rites, but from the rain cistern, collected months ago during the rare but generous storms. He ladles it into a shallow basin, lets it settle, and then gently weights a linen cloth that is already half as old as he is. Cleaning a crocodile god is not a dramatic affair. Menu dabs more than scrubs, lifts dust with practiced flicks. The statues there are 3. Watch him with sightless eyes. One is carved from dark green diorite, its tail curled around a base of lotus petals. Another is older, with chipped fangs and a snubbed snout. The third is bronze, polished so often that its face has become a blur. He speaks to none of them. The gods, he says, don't need words before breakfast. Long ago, when Menu was still a young initiate with shaking hands and too many questions, He'd tried to recite prayers while polishing the bronze sobek. He got as far as the third line, before accidentally knocking the offering bowl over, sending figs rolling under a basket of reeds. After that, the head priest told him, "Respect the god with silence. Your hands are prayers enough." And so, for 47 years, Menu's hands have said all that needed saying. Each morning, he follows the same pattern. First, he cleans the offering, shelf-wiping away yesterday's breadcrumbs, brushing off beetle husks, and removing wilted lotus petals left by pilgrims. Then he refreshes the bowl of natron powder, not because the god uses it, of course not, but because everything in a shrine should smell faintly of salt and cleanliness. It's a kind of ritual punctuation, the way you might end a sentence with a gentle sigh. After this, he lays a fresh offering, a dish of dates, a small cake, and a cup of water that will evaporate long before noon. Some days there's honey. Some days, if a merchant has passed through with a generous heart, there might even be a slice of cheese. Always, though, there is the blue lotus. It is not for eating, nor even for the god's pleasure, really. It is for the silence. A way to still the air. One blossom, floated gently in a clay bowl, gives off a smell that can only be described as sleep pretending to be a flower. Cleaning the shrine is not just about the gods. It is about time. Time settles into the cracks of stone. Time curls beneath shelves, between glyphs, behind the eyes of painted crocodiles on the wall. Menu moves slowly because hurrying would be an insult. These statues have waited for thousands of years. They can wait 5 more minutes for their faces to be polished. There are many tools involved in shrine cleaning. Feather wands for spider webs, flat, chipped stones for lifting candle wax, little reed combs for brushing dust out of hieroglyphs, a broken shell used for catching errant oil drips. He keeps them all in a narrow wooden box beside the altar, wrapped in old linen and labeled in his own hand. Useful things that don't annoy Sobek. When the tasks are done, Menu sits on a low stool and watches the light change. This is his favorite part, because cleaning a crocodile shrine teaches you the secret of shadows. You learn how a single sunbeam slides across a carved fang, how golden light pools in the curve of a statue's tail, how the walls seem to exhale when the heat begins to rise. Sometimes he dozes, not for long, just long enough to dream of water and salt. Not all crocodile gods are so lucky. Other temples along the Nile keep mummified crocodiles in glassy tombs, rows of leathery, stuffed beasts, preserved with spices and mystery, watched by yawning guards, and the occasional child tossing pebbles. But here, in Menu's little shrine, the crocodiles are never mummified. They are smooth and shining and watched over daily. One afternoon, years ago, a young novice asked him, "Do you think Sobek is happy with what we do?" Menu didn't answer at first. He was busy removing a fly from the statue's mouth. Then, he said Sobek was born in the mud. He likes quiet and clean teeth. The novice had not returned after that. Occasionally, a festival arrives. On those days, the shrine blooms into life. Women in linen dresses sweep the floors in rhythmic spirals. Children run barefoot, clutching amulets shaped like crocodile eggs. Musicians line the entrance, playing sleepy tunes on lyres and pipes. A priest from the city temple might come with fresh oil or a scroll to read aloud. But even then, Menu's work does not change. He still wakes before dawn, still weights his cloth, still polishes the diorite snout with the same slow circles. He still watches the sun enter the shrine like a careful visitor. There is comfort in knowing your purpose. The shrine will outlast him. One day, someone else will inherit the linen cloths, the reed combs, the broken shell. Perhaps they'll change the way the offering is placed. Perhaps they'll talk too much at first, but eventually they too will learn the language of silence. It is written nowhere, but it is known that the god of crocodiles does not need sacrifice. He needs care. He needs hands that do not rush, feet that do not echo, a cup of water and a lotus blossom, and someone to keep him clean. Even when the world forgets, he's there. As the sun rises higher, Menu locks the outer gate. The shrine is now full of light, heavy with heat and the scent of sweet cake. He nods to the statues as he passes. Rest well, he murmurs, not because they need rest, but because he does. And as he steps outside, the croak of a frog in the canal greets him like a benediction. Another shrine, another morning. Another day the crocodile god is clean. Another moment in the slow, sleepy life of the Nile. Long before the sun crowned the stone temples of Thebes with gold, before the chants of priests stirred the air or scribes began their ink-stained day, a girl with quiet fingers sat beside bubbling copper pots, watching perfume rise into steam. Her name was Satire. She was not a queen or a priestess, but her hands knew secrets that even scribes envy, its secrets of scent, of delicate distillations, of the memory locked inside crushed petals. Satire was the daughter of a perfumer in the royal compound of Hatshepsut. Hers was a life of slow rituals, not unlike prayer, where patience, warmth, and silence were more valuable than gold. She woke before dawn, always. The Nile was still a shadow then, not yet silvered by morning. In the courtyard of her family's workshop, she swept away stray lotus petals from the night before. The jars were already cooling, and the air smelled like last night's work, faintly of sweet marjoram, cedarwood, and the clinging sharpness of cassia bark. Her father, who had once studied temple chemistry, but left to chase the subtler art of fragrance, believed perfume was memory, not merely beauty or status. He often told her, "A queen forgets the gifts she's given, but not the smell of the one who gave them." And indeed, queens did not forget Satire's family. Their household served the court of Hatshepsut, not directly, not daily, but when the queen's women needed new oils or ointments, when the sacred scent to accompany an offering was required, was Satire's father they summoned, and increasingly it was Satire who prepared the jars. She was 14 when she first touched myrrh. Alone it came in rough granules, dark as pomegranate skin and sticky as honey in summer. Imported from Punt, it arrived in little alabaster jars, sealed with mud. Satire's task was to grind it slowly, then boil it in a mixture of sesame oil and river water. Though the water had to be blessed and cooled overnight under the stars, the scent of myrrh took its time. It didn't shout like cinnamon or sing. Like blue lotus, it crept, it unfolded, warm, smoky, a little bitter. The kind of smell that stayed on linen for days, and linen mattered. For the perfumes she made weren't for the skin alone. No queens perfumed their linens, their wigs, their writing reeds, their pets. Linen itself held its own rank. Satire had once met a linen girl whose threads were woven so fine they shimmered like light on water. Perfume and linen were sisters, the girl had said. Satire never forgot that. She often watched the jars cool while thinking of all the places her oils would go. Would this pot of lotus scent be used on the queen's sandals? Would the cedarwood ointment be massaged into the hair of a diplomat's daughter before a feast? Sometimes she helped the servants pack small ceramic bottles into padded crate seats. Painted with care, a blue flower, a falcon, a line from a hymn to Hathor. Perfume was not thrown together, it was art, a whisper. A kind of invisible elegance. She learned to love ingredients the way her friends loved jewelry. Cassia bark, heavy and almost musky. Frankincense, with its pale ghost-like trails. Galbanum, sharp as vinegar, but softened with water and time. Her favorite, though, was blue lotus. Blue lotus had to be gathered at night. In the day, the flowers opened and floated, but at dusk they closed, folding into themselves like sleeping birds. The best blossoms were cut before sunrise, soaked in warm oil, and left to steep under the sun. The smell, it was dreamlike. Something between honey and dusk. A smell that made one feel they had walked too far into a memory. Satya once spilled a little on her palm while pouring, and her father scolded her gently. "Never wear what is not meant for you," he said. But later, she caught him sniffing the air where she had stood. Eyes closed. The Queen's court had its own rhythm, but Satya rarely visited it. Her world was quieter jars, firewood, cloths. For filtering, silence broken only by the flutter of pigeons. She listened to gossip from her father's customers, who had fallen from favor. Which noble had requested scented ink? What temples now used cinnamon to burn in the offering halls? Perfume was political. It was religious. It was seductive. Even funerary rituals involved it. Embalmers used special unguents to scent the dead, to keep their bodies pure for the gods. Satya had once been asked to prepare an oil for a priestess of Isis who had passed away. She was instructed to use no cinnamon, no cassia, only myrrh, blue lotus, and a rare addition, crushed almond. Almond meant remembrance. Satya ground it with care and held the oil to her nose before sealing it. It smelled like peace. One evening, a strange order came, an urgent request from the Queen's perfumery scribe. They needed a small pot of kifi. Satya's heart fluttered. Kifi was not simple. It was the most sacred of mixtures. A perfume burned, not worn, made with more than a dozen ingredients: raisins, wine, honey, myrrh, frankincense, juniper berries, mastic. She worked late, careful and slow. The air turned sweet and smoky. Her fingers were sticky with resin. When she handed the pot to the courier at dawn, her face was flushed with tired pride. Her father looked at her and said, "You've made something for the gods." Satya smiled. She felt she had. Later that morning, while washing the tools by the river's edge, she dipped her arms into the Nile and watched the water curl around her like silk. The scent of kifi still clung to her sleeves. A breeze stirred the reeds. Somewhere a ibis called. She closed her eyes. The Nile, she thought, was a perfume of its own. One no hand could bottle. One that wrapped itself around temples, queens, and quiet girls who boiled oil in copper pots. Before dawn, the perfume of river queens lingered long after they left the earth, and so would hers. The Nile changes its voice in the south. It becomes slower, more reflective. Its waters glide past boulders and reeds in long sighs, brushing against the ankles of silent workers who spend their lives bent over mud and minerals. Down near the first cataracts where the river begins to break and tumble over rock, there is a boy named Akam who sifts sunlight from the riverbed. He is not a prince, not a priest, not a warrior. He is simply a Nubian gold washer. And like the river, he is in no hurry. Akam's morning, mist, silence, and the sifting panther sun has not yet cleared the sandstone cliffs when Arkham slides his bare feet into the soft mud at the edge of the Nile. The air is cool, but not cold. The sort of hush that holds birdsong gently inside it. Arkham carries around shallow pan made of woven reeds sealed with bitumen. It is smooth from years of use, passed down from his grandfather, who once told him that the river whispers to those who listen. He does not begin with work. He begins with stillness. The river must greet him first. He lets his hand trail through the water, fingers spread. He does not pray in words, but in presence. Then, crouching in the reeds, he scoops up a mix of sand, clay, and crushed stone from a basin near the bank. This is what he will sift all day. Gold dust, if any, is hidden like a secret within it. A.K. Hom stands in waist-deep water and begins to swirl the pan slowly. Not a sound beyond the lazy plop of water shifting over the edge. Not a thought beyond the swirling gold. Dust and gentle labor gold does not sparkle when you find it in the river. It looks like mud, like silt, like nothing. Only when the light hits it just so glinting at a stubborn angle does the boy's heart quicken a little. A fleck, no larger than a fingernail clipping. Sometimes not even that. Just a shimmer that refuses to be washed away. He gathers them into a small cloth pouch tied at his hip. Each fleck is a story someone else will finish. Gold is never for him. Dreaming of nobles with painted eyes as he sifts, Arkham daydreams, not of being rich, not of becoming someone else, but of wondering what do they do with all this gold. He imagines a noblewoman reclining on a boat, her eyes rimmed with kohl and her fingers heavy with rings. Did this gold touch her skin? Did she complain that the necklace was too heavy? He imagines a tiny statue in a temple, its surface gleaming. Perhaps a priest kissed it as the sun rose, or perhaps the gold sits untouched in some storeroom beneath. The palace, hoarded, forgotten, waiting. The boy smiles to himself. Even gold, it seems, might feel a little lonely. The pace of the southern river, the work, is monotonous, and that is what Arkham likes about it. The rhythm of swirl, rinse, dump, repeat. The little ache in his arms by midday. The way the reeds sway, never too urgently, in the hot breeze. From the higher banks, his younger sister sometimes watches him. She brings dates, wrapped in leaves, and sometimes a little flatbread. She jokes that one day she'll find more gold in the kitchen ashes than he will from the river. They laugh softly. They have never quarreled. The day stretches on, slow and golden dots. Songs in the mud Nubian workers often hum while they labor. Songs without words, just sound and breath. Arkham hums too, not for joy, not for sadness, but simply because sound keeps the hours company. He has heard traders from the north sing of cities and gods and ships with white sails, but his songs are of stone, water, and the weight of time. Some of the older men say that gold sings too, but only when you aren't listening for it. That feels true gold for Pharaoh. Bread for Arkham. Late afternoon, Arkham has a small collection of grains and flakes. Not much, not enough to impress a tax collector, but enough to exchange for flour, maybe some honey. All gold is technically Pharaoh's. The officials will come downriver in a few weeks to collect what has been gathered. They will inspect the scales. They will nod solemnly. They will say the gods are pleased. Arkham does not care. He has what he needs, gold for Pharaoh, bread for Arkham. The forgotten end of empire where Arkham works. The empire is a whisper. There are no monuments here, no marble columns or towering pylons. only stone huts, soft winds, and the scent of river lilies. But it is still Egypt, still sacred and Akum. Quiet boy in muddy water is part of it, a part that will never be recorded in scrolls or tombs. But perhaps, if the gods are kind, they'll remember the boy who sang to gold dust in the river Dot, evening reflections as the sun turns copper and shadows stretch across the water. A calm rinses his pan one last time and lifts his sack. He does not count what he's found. The day's work is over, its value is not in weight. Walking home barefoot, he steps on cool pebbles, the earth still warm beneath him. His sister runs ahead, chasing a heron that flies just out of reach in the distance. The Nile shimmers like poured glass. Somewhere far away, a golden statue glows in the last light of day. But down here, in the quiet southern mud, a boy has already found his treasure, peace, rhythm, and a river that remembers him. The Nile shimmered quietly beneath the noonday sun, its waters lazily brushing the stone banks outside a small trading post just east of Hermopolis. The breeze was stubborn and slow, nudging at palm fronds that had no real interest in rustling. On the dusty path beside the river, a long caravan of camels stood still, not in transit, not quite resting either. They simply stood, except for one. That one camel was sitting, just sitting. Her name, as the drover swore under his breath, was Menot, after the goddess of birth and fate. And on this particular day, Menot had decided, by some cosmic alignment or sheer will of stubborn anatomy, that she would go no further. The caravan was meant to leave at dawn. Its route was carefully planned, stretching from the perfumed markets of Thebes to the bustling port at Alexandria. It carried bundles of linen, sacks of barley, sealed amphorae of wine, dyed cloths, baskets of dried figs, and scrolls wrapped in waxed linen. None of it terribly urgent, but all of it necessary for someone. Alexandria's merchants waited for these goods to appear like slow magic, carried northward across dust, stone, and river Dot. The camel drivers, 10 in number, had woken early, their yawns echoing over the sandbanks as they checked their ropes and fed the animals sour bread soaked in water. The youngest boy, Senui, had even braided little beads into the tassels on Menat's halter, as if to encourage good luck. But as the sun lifted itself over the horizon like a sluggish eyelid, Menat folded her legs beneath her and sat, then refused to rise. Camels are not known for their obedience, nor for their diplomacy. They spit when annoyed, groan when bored, and regard humans with a detached disdain honed over millennia. Menot's face was expressionless, her jaw rhythmically chewing a wad of partially regurgitated fodder, while flies buzzed contentedly around her haunches. The drover, named Wee, tried everything. He tugged the halter, he lifted her tail, he clicked his tongue and muttered charms. He pretended to walk away. He offered a piece of fig. He tapped her shoulder with a reed stick. Menat blinked slowly and remained exactly where she was. The rest of the Camels Elevan Inn all watched this ritual, with the bored interest of spectators at a very dull play. One sneezed, another flopped down, perhaps out of solidarity. The caravan was going nowhere, and so began the long, unplanned pause. Time in ancient Egypt was measured not just by sundials and water clocks, but by the rhythm of ordinary interruptions. Waiting was not unusual. Sandstorms delayed messengers. Cows wandered across ferry loading ramps. Priests insisted on blessing cargo before it could be moved. Boats got stuck in mud. But a camel choosing not to stand, that was something else entirely. As the midday heat thickened like honey, the men laid out woven mats and brewed watered beer from a clay jug buried in the cool of the cargo baskets. A few played senet on a scratched board with pebbles for pieces. Sinui, the youngest, began telling a story he'd heard from his grandfather about a demon that made animals forget their purpose. The others laughed, half listening, and still Manat sat in the long delay. A sort of archaeology of boredom began to unfold. Someone noticed the fraying on the rope that bound the wine amphory. Someone else carefully retied a sack of emmer grain. One man napped beneath the shadow of a linen bale. Senui wandered toward the river's edge and watched dragonflies skim the surface like little oared boats. He wondered how far dragonflies could fly. He thought of the harbor in Alexandria. He had never seen it. He imagined vast ships with red sails, the towering lighthouse, the scent of strange oils. Would the figs they carried still be sweet when they arrived? He picked a pebble from the bank and tossed it into the river. It plopped with the softest sound. The Nile didn't care about delays. It had always moved like this, slow, wide, unhurried. Time wasn't lost. It simply ... waited. Eventually, a passing old man from a nearby fishing village paused at the scene. "She won't get up?" he asked with a grin, watching Menat ruminate. "She's cursed," muttered we. The old man squatted beside the camel and scratched her gently behind the ear. "You overloaded her," he said after a moment. "She doesn't like wine, but it's sealed." We protested. "She doesn't like the idea of wine," the man replied sagely, eyes twinkling. "She's a pious creature." Then he stood, adjusted his reed sandals, and walked off, whistling. The drovers stared after him. One snorted. Another tried moving the amphory to a different camel, just in case. Still, Menat sat, and in that stillness, the caravan began to remember things. They remembered other delays, other camels, other journeys. One man recalled a sandstorm outside Abydos when they had huddled beneath the bellies of their beasts, the wind howling like spirits. Another remembered a time when their water jars broke and they survived 2 days on melted date syrup. Sinui quietly asked we how long he had been leading caravans. 33 seasons, we said, his gaze on the horizon. Maybe hard to count when every journey looks like the last one. They watched the sun tilt westward. Shadows grew long. Manat shifted slightly, but did not rise. The Nile changed color slowly, as it always did. Gold softened to blue, blue to violet. Bats flickered above the reeds. Someone lit a small oil lamp and tied it to a camel's pack. It wobbled with the faint wind. The caravan would sleep here tonight, beneath a sky powdered with stars. As they unrolled their blankets and nibbled on dried lentils and bread, no one seemed angry anymore. The delay had simply become part of the journey. It was a gift, in its own strange way, a day without urgency. A day to listen to each other's stories. A day to remember that the land itself often decided the rhythm of life, not the ambitions of merchants. Just before dawn, with no warning at all, Manat stood. No one coaxed her. No one noticed at first. She simply unfolded herself, groaning slightly, and stood tall among her companions, as if nothing had happened. She shook her long neck, blinked at the pinkening sky, and chewed her cud. The caravan scrambled into motion, ropes tightened, baskets hoisted. Sleep was rubbed from eyes. Camels groaned. We patted Manat's flank with a mixture of irritation and respect. "Now you rise," he asked. Manat offered no answer. And so, as the first sunbeam touched the Nile, The caravan moved again, slowly, patiently, as it had done 100 times before, and would do again. Somewhere ahead, Alexandria waited, or didn't. It hardly mattered. The river, the sand, the camels, and the people, they would get there eventually, even if the camel had other ideas. The sun rose slowly over Elephantine Island, painting the Nile in liquid gold, as if it too were a lazy beekeeper spreading honey across the land. This island, nestled near the first cataract where the Nile turns rocky and wild, had once buzzed with diplomatic importance. Traders from Nubia passed through, priests watched for omens in the flow of water, and soldiers guarded the southern frontier of Egypt. But now, in this quiet moment, the only buzz was the soft hum of bees. Tepi, a man with soft eyes and slower hands, woke just as the first light warmed the low mud-brick walls of his house. His bees were already stirring. He could feel it in his bones. He lived near the temple ruins and fig trees, where the bees liked to build their hives in cylindrical clay tubes stacked like bread, loaves against the stone walls. He greeted them the same way every morning. "Good morning, my ladies," he whispered. "Did the night treat you kindly?" Some said talking to bees was nonsense, but the elders remembered that bees carried the tears of Ra, the sun god, and if Ra wept, it was only polite to listen to his golden messengers. Tepi moved slowly. There was no rush. The bees did not like loud noises or quick motions, and neither did his knees. He fetched a little censer, the kind his grandfather once used, and burned some dried herbs, thyme and mint. Not to harm the bees, of course, just to lull them into drowsy calm. He never smoked them harshly. They trusted him, and he had no wish to anger them. He worked under the date palms with the quiet assurance of someone who had done this every week for 40 years. He lifted the lids off the tubes with a curved reed knife, careful not to crush any of his buzzing companions. The honey inside smelled faintly of desert flowers, river blossoms, and wild fig. It was not the best honey in Egypt. Those honors belonged to northern marshes, but it had a certain lazy charm. He filled a clay pot with golden syrup and wiped the rim with a frayed linen cloth. A single bee landed on his wrist, paused there like a punctuation mark in the sentence of the morning, then drifted away. "Off to report, are you?" Tepi said, smiling. Behind him, the island murmured, not in words, but in sounds so ordinary. They seemed invisible. The rustling of reeds, the soft slap of water against stone, the distant thump of a fisherman's or a donkey braid somewhere near the granaries, and a boy laughed, likely chasing goats again. Tepi did not care for cities. The last time he went to Aswan proper, a scribe tried to cheat him in a honey trade. "This smells like camel," the scribe had sneered, though his own breath was worse than anything a camel might emit. Still, honey had its uses beyond flavor. The priests on the island used it in temple rituals, mixing it with myrrh and natron to anoint statues of Khnum. Doctors sent requests for honey to mix with herbs for healing wounds. Even the garrison soldiers, too tough to admit weakness, would sometimes knock on Tepi's door in the late evening. "My friend cut his foot," one would say. "Did he cut it falling into beer?" Tepi would joke. "Usually, yes, but today there were no priests, no soldiers, no complaints, just bees and silence." He sat on a small stool near the edge of the river and watched a barge go by, its wide sail catching the breeze. He waved at it. A man waved back. He didn't know who it was, and it didn't matter. Elephantine used to be a border town. Now it felt like the edge of time itself, somewhere between history and daydream. Sometimes Tepi imagined that the bees were spies, not for any king or enemy, but for the river itself. They flew up and down the Nile, collecting scents and stories. They whispered of grain stored in Luxor, of funerals in Thebes, of girls dancing in Memphis. They came home not just full of nectar, but news. He once told this theory to a priest. "And what does the river tell them?" The priest asked, smiling indulgently. "That we're all very silly," Tepi replied, "and we worry too much." The priest had laughed, but softly, perhaps because he agreed. By midday, the bees had quieted. Their foraging paused in the thick sun. Tepi sealed the clay pots and carried them to the shade. He would trade one for barley, another for soap, and keep a third for himself. He dipped a wooden spoon into the last jar and tasted it, letting the honey sit on his tongue like a slow poem. In the far distance, the temple bells rang, or maybe it was the bray of another donkey. The sound rolled lazily over the island like the breeze. Tepi looked at his bees one last time before retreating indoors. They were asleep or dreaming. He could never tell which dot, and all around him, Elephantine Island drifted in the river's warm breath, half forgotten, half golden, entirely at peace. The morning mist still lingered over the banks of Memphis as old Menenhet shuffled down to his workshop, a bent figure wrapped in sun-faded linen. The Nile exhaled softly beside him, wide and steady as always, its waters shimmering with that half-light that seems to make time forget itself. Here, in a quiet inlet just a short walk from the city's bustling riverfront, the boatmaker's yard stirred only with the chirping of herons and the occasional clunk of a wooden plank adjusting itself in the humidity. His grandson, little Kemwas, followed behind at a respectful distance, arms tucked inside his tunic against the morning chill. Menenhet had told him not to rush. That was the first lesson. "You build a boat like you tend a fire," the old man had said the day before. "You feed it, shape it, watch it, but never rush it. A river doesn't care if you're late." The workshop was little more than a broad stretch of beaten earth, shaded by a weathered awning of reeds and cloth. Tools were simple: bronze adzes, stone weights, wooden pegs, clay pots of pitch, and in the middle of it all lay the skeleton of a new riverboat, its planks half fastened, half floating in intention. Kemwasit stood in awe. It wasn't his first boat, but it was the first he would help build from the start. His hands itched with eagerness. Menenhet smiled faintly. "Come," the old man beckoned, "time for the steam." Wood that listens, they began by soaking long strips of acacia in steaming troughs beside the fire pit. The smell was richethy, sappy, a little sweet. The heat coaxed the stiffness out of the wood, letting it bend slowly into shape rather than splintering under pressure. Menenhet always spoke to the wood as if it were a sleepy animal. "You don't command wood," he said, gently pressing a plank into the boat's frame with the help of wet linen cords. "You persuade it, talk to it, let it understand what it's becoming." Kemwas had tried. He whispered to his plank like it was a skittish donkey. It cracked anyway. Menenhet just chuckled. "Better a crack now than later, eh? You'll feel it in your fingertips next time." All morning they worked this way. Heat, bend, rest. No hammering, no rush. And between every task, time seemed to widen, as if the river itself had loaned its rhythm to the boy's heartbeat. Lessons. In patience during breaks, Menenhet would sit beneath the awning and tell stories of boats long gone of grain barges that floated from Thebes to Alexandria. their sails fat with wind and their hulls heavy with bread, of warships rowed by sweating conscripts who sang just to keep the oars moving, of funeral boats carved for queens, their gold-leafed cabins creaking gently as they slid past sobbing priests. Boats are not just wood and rope, he said. They're memories. They float on water, yes, but also on time. Camwasset wondered what memories their little boat might carry. A fisherman, maybe. A wedding procession. A sleepy priest taking Sobek across the Nile for festival rites. The idea comforted him. Like wrapping oneself in a grandmother's shawl, boat shapes and the shape of the Nile traced designs in the sand to explain why their boat needed to curve this way, or why the prow should angle just so. The Nile, he said, had moods sometimes calm as oil, sometimes shivering with hidden winds. You build for both, he explained, not because you fear the river, but because you respect her. Their boat would have no sail, just a wide belly for balance, a shallow draft to avoid sandbanks, and a pair of wooden eyes painted on the bow so the boat could see where it was going. The eyes mattered most. A blind boat is a foolish boat, Menonhead said. Pitch and prayers by afternoon. They were heating black pitch to seal the seams, thick, sticky, pungent stuff, bubbling like some ancient potion. Menonhead let the boy brush it on, a careful sweep along each line of wood. It dripped like molasses, sealing stories inside the planks as the fumes rose. The old man mumbled a little prayer to Kumem, the ram-headed god of crafts. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet habit, like blowing on a bowl of soup. Camwasset followed, stumbling over the words but meaning them just the same. The boat didn't speak back, but somehow it felt different after the prayers. Heavier, more real. The gift of slowness days passed like this. Early mornings, long shadows, the croak of frogs, sand in sandals, sap under fingernails. Menonhead never hurried. When a plank didn't fit, they sat and watched the river until it did. When the wind was wrong for drying the pitch, they waited and carved pegs. Camwasset learned that slowness wasn't laziness, it was care. It was listening to wood, to weather, to the hush of the Nile as it passed like a mother singing a baby to sleep. He also learned that not every lesson came from words. Menonhead said little while, shaping the curved stern, but in the way his hands moved steady, knowing. Kind there was an entire language of patience. The launch when the boat was finally ready, they slid it into the river at dawn. Not with ceremony or drums, but with a low hum from Menonhead, like a lullaby. The hull kissed the water, bobbed gently, and accepted its new home with barely a splash. Camwasset stood barefoot on the shore, watching it float. A real boat. His boat, well, theirs. The old man clapped a hand on his shoulder. You'll build your own one day, maybe better, but only if you go slowly. Camwasset nodded. He didn't want to rush that day, not yet. Reflection, boats that carry time across. Egypt, great monuments, rose temples, pyramids, colossal statues that touched the sun. But none of them moved. None of them whispered. Boats did. They creaked and hummed and sighed. They took dreams up the Nile and brought spices down. They ferried the dead and the living alike, and the quiet men who built them slowly, carefully, in the shadow of trees and under the eye of the wind left no names behind. Only boats, and in every one of those boats floated stories, sealed in pitch, polished in patience, and shaped by hands that never hurried. Just like the river, just like time. Long before the river crested its banks, before the sweet green weeds began to whisper of rising waters, before the fish leapt higher than usual in the shallows. There were the stars, and in a sleepy village, far from any palace wall or temple, chant, a little girl sat cross-legged in the dust, cradling a polished copper bowl. She was the daughter of a quiet man who rarely spoke except to the heavens. He was not a priest or a scholar, nor even a well-known soothsayer. He was simply a reader of stars, one of many across Egypt who kept a quiet vigil for the first signs of the flood. Copper, bowl, and quiet nights. Her name was Tia. She was 9. When her father first handed her the bowl, it had been buffed so often it nearly gleamed like water. She was to fill it from the well at sunset and carry it carefully out to the flat roof where her father waited with a reed mat, a handful of figs, and his worn wooden tablet where he scratched his little glyphs in ink. When the sky darkened and the stars began to flicker one by one, her father would lean over the bowl, peering into the reflection, watching not the heavens directly but how they trembled in the water. It was this trembling that told him things. When Sirius rose, what they called Sopdate meant the Nile would soon rise too. But it was never just about one star. It was about the shimmer of the whole sky, how the river and the stars mirrored one another in slow, silent conversation. And now Tia watched with him. She thought the stars moved like shy dancers, hesitant and soft-footed. She imagined them as gentle spirits that didn't want to disturb the hush of night, tiptoeing across the sky just as the Nile tiptoed out of its bed at first, only to roar later like a lion waking. Flood-time dreams. Every village knew the river was coming. It always did. But when, and how high, and for how long? The priestly temples in Heliopolis and Thebes had their great stone calendars, their gnomons and observatories. But the smaller places relied on stargazers like Tia's father, men who passed on no written scrolls, but held generations of watching in their minds, and slowly that quiet knowledge was dripping into Tia like honey through a sieve. The bowl was her favorite thing, more than the little wooden dolls her mother carved, more than the goat kid she fed each morning, more than even the sweet sticky date cakes made for the new year when the flood came. Because in that bowl she saw not only stars, but the ripples of stories. One night, when she was 11, her father slept early, and Tia sat alone with the bowl. The stars were silent, but very clear. She watched a single line of light crawl across the water's surface, not a star, but perhaps a messenger, a sign. She whispered to it, though she didn't know what to say. When she told her father the next day, he simply nodded. "We are listeners," he said, "not deciders." Floods shape everything. When the flood came late, it worried the villagers. They built their little dikes and checked their granaries twice. When it came too early, they sang songs to quiet the river's temper. But when it came just on time, as it usually did, it brought life. The flood carried not just water, but earth, that rich black silt called Kemet, the very name of the land. Without it, there would be no wheat, no barley, no papyrus to scribble on. And so, star watching was not a luxury. It was survival in slow motion. It was a yearly rhythm that hummed through the bones of Egypt like the low strum of a harp string. It affected when people planted, when they harvested, when they celebrated, when they rested. It shaped time. Even the great king's calendar bent to the river, and in a modest hut far from Memphis or Karnak, a little girl helped shape that time, too, though no one outside her village knew it. A bowl full of light. As Tia grew, she noticed things her father had never taught. How sometimes the stars blinked faster on certain nights. How some frogs began to croak differently just before the first moist wind from the south. She noticed the copper bowl worked better when she rubbed it with tamarisk leaves. That if she sat very still, the stars seemed to lean in closer, as if curious about her. In truth, she wasn't always sure if she was seeing the future or just imagining it. But her father never scolded. Seeing clearly is not about being certain, he would say, brushing dust from his tablet. It is about being still. Tia was very good at being still. A night with no stars one summer, clouds covered the sky for many nights in a row. It was just after her 15th birthday. The village grew anxious. The cows lowed restlessly. The canal water felt oddly warm. Tia sat on the roof anyway, bowl in hand, watching the grey shimmer of clouds reflected on the water. She missed the stars, missed their hush and their guidance. But then something strange happened. She began to notice patterns in the clouds, the way they curled, how they opened in slow pulses, like a flower waking. She whispered to them, and to the reflection, and thought she saw perhaps, just for a moment, the outline of Sopdet breaking through. The flood came 5 days later, gentle and just high enough. Afterward, her father called her my little cloud reader. The wisdom of the river Tia never left her village. She never walked in the great markets of Thebes, never saw the colossal obelisks rise. She never tasted honey from Punt or cinnamon from Syria. But she knew something many scribes did not. She knew how to read a river that spoke in silence. She knew the sky was not only above, but within the water. She knew time was not a thing that marched, but a thing that drifted, circled, returned, and she passed her bowl down to her daughter one day, as her father had done before, and the stars, as always, continued their quiet dance. The morning mist still clung to the fields when the old farmer slipped away from his house with a quiet sigh and a red basket under one arm. His sandals scuffed softly against the earthen path, and in his other hand he carried a simple rod of palmwood worn smooth by years of quiet patience. The canal beside his land, the one that had once been lively with young boys splashing and waterbirds stalking, was still and shallow, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of a fish or the slow-moving shadow of a lily pad. He was not hungry. He had eaten bread and lentils at dawn and would have figs later. He didn't need the fish. Not really, but he needed the stillness. He settled himself at the canal's edge with the stiff, creaking motion of someone who had lived too many planting seasons to rush anything. His knees cracked softly as he bent, and he tucked his cloak around him against the early breeze. Then he set the line in the water and stared at the slow drift of clouds reflected in the muddy surface. The truth was, the fish rarely came anymore. The canal had silted in over the years, and the younger farmers spoke of deeper places, downriver, with better chances. But this little turn in the water, this quiet curve beside the palm tree with the forked top hat, been his fishing spot since boyhood, since the time his father first showed him how to hold the rod just right, and to listen more to the water than to the reeds. Back then, the canal had overflowed every year with the flood, leaving fresh silt and wriggling silver fish in its wake. Frogs croaked in chorus at the edge of every field, and dragonflies skated the surface like tiny gods of the air. Boys raced each other down the levees, slipping and laughing, while men with nets waded knee-deep in the warm, muddy water. But time, like the river, never turns back. Now the frogs were fewer, and the boys had their own children. The old man's sons had fields to tend, wives to please, oxen to feed. They would wave politely if they passed, but they no longer joined him with their own lines and hopeful baskets. So he fished alone, and as he waited, his thoughts drifted, not toward the bait or the current, but toward the seasons, the planting times, the years when the barley grew tall, and the years when the locusts came early. The year the Nile rose to high, drowning the melon rose. The year it barely rose at all, and the cracked fields looked like parched skin, and always the fish had returned. He remembered how, in the worst years, when hunger curled around the village like smoke, it was the canal that had fed them. Little perch, slick and cold, fried over the fire. Not much, but enough to last until the next harvest. He remembered how his wife had salted them, her fingers quick and sure, humming the same tune every time. A tune he could no longer recall in full, but one that came back in pieces whenever. The water lapped just right against the stone edge. A tug on the line, just a whisper of movement, brought him back to the present. He waited, then the tug faded, replaced by stillness again. Perhaps a fish had nosed the bait and swum away. Perhaps it had never been a fish at all. Perhaps it didn't matter. He leaned back and let the sun warm his eyelids across the canal. A heron lifted its leg with exquisite slowness and stalked something in the shallows. Its reflection shivered as it moved. Bees buzzed among the reeds. Somewhere far off, a flute played a lazy tune, drifting from a house where someone was still brewing beer for the midday meal. The farmer did not move. This too was part of the rhythm. Not all farmers chased the turning of the seasons. Some sat still and remembered when the canal was full of boys and frogs, when the fish were easy and the world was smaller. Remembered when his own father sat beside him, neither speaking, both content with the silence. The old man's rod dipped slightly, but he did not check the line. He only smiled. The Nile fed many people in many ways. It fed grain and fish. It fed frogs and reeds. It fed dreams and sorrows, too. And sometimes it simply fed memory. A breeze passed across the water, stirring the papyrus and cooling his cheeks. He stayed until the sun began to lean westward and the shadows of palm trees stretched long and thin across the fields. Then he gathered his rod and his empty basket lighter, somehow, than when he had arrived, and began the slow walk home, not with a fish, but with a full heart. Tomorrow he might try again, or he might simply sit, because sometimes, in the slow drift of the Nile and the patient watching of the water, it was not the fish that mattered, but the quiet. In a shaded room overlooking the Nile's golden glare, a noblewoman named Teot sat on a cushioned bench beside a low window. Morning had only just begun, but already the air shimmered with that familiar desert heat, the kind that made linen cling to the skin and silence feel heavier than words. Her servants moved slowly, soft-footed on the reed matting. Their hands carried jars of unguents, shallow dishes of coal, and folded squares of perfumed cloth. But Teot, like every morning, asked first for her mirror. It was not made in Egypt. That was what made it special. This mirror, small bronze oval, and slightly darkened with age, had been gifted by a visiting trader from Kush many years before. Its handle, carved from ebony, curved like a gazelle's horn. The bronze was imperfect, with waves that slightly warped the reflection, but Teot liked that. It made the face looking back at her feel like someone from a dream. She lifted it gently from its embroidered pouch and tilted it toward the light. A thin film of dust danced across its surface, disturbed only by the soft sigh of her breath as she exhaled slowly through her nose. I look more like my grandmother each day, she murmured, the young servant girl kneeling beside her Meru. No older than 15, gave a polite, practiced smile. Teot smiled too, brushing her fingers across the mirror's surface. She would have liked this mirror. She had her own from Canaan, copper, not bronze, and she used to say that it never quite told the truth. Meru listened carefully. In Teot's house, stories often came this way, wrapped in silences and memories, folded gently like clothes for travel. The lady liked to speak slowly, especially during the rituals of dressing. Hair being combed, oils being applied, bracelets snapped shut with soft clicks. All the while, stories drifted between them, as if part of the scent of frankincense or the hush of linen on skin. This morning, the story was about mirrors. You know, Teot said, lifting the mirror to catch her own tired eyes, this one came up the Nile in a basket of perfumes. The trader was tall, wore leopard skin, claimed it had belonged to the sister of a queen. She paused, as if waiting for the weight of the tale to settle in the air. He probably lied. She added mildly. Meru giggled before catching herself. Teot smiled again. She liked that. A servant who remembered to be quiet, but not so quiet. She forgot to laugh. Still, Teot said, holding up the mirror so both of them could see into it. Some stories are worth keeping, even if they're false. The mirror's journey, the bronze mirror, was, by any measure, an object of immense travel. Forged in the land of Kush, far to the south of Egypt, it had been hammered and polished by skilled hands. Kushite bronze was slightly different from the Egyptian blend, deeper in hue, often mixed with imported tin from as far away as Anatolia. The handle had been carved from ebony, another southern treasure, traded alongside ivory, incense, and gold dust. The mirror, before ever seeing Teot's face, had passed through dozens of hands, carried by caravan to Napata or Meru, then bundled into a boat that hugged the Nile's curling banks, through cataracts and lazy eddies, past crocodiles sunning on stones. The mirror had slowly floated, north-ducked, inside a merchant satchel, alongside polished lip pots and carved figurines. When it reached Thebes, it passed again sold, gifted, forgotten briefly in a nobleman's courtyard. Eventually it made its way into Teot's villa, wrapped in linen, resting between a clay jar of honeyed almonds and a small necklace of cowrie shells. Now it lived here, beside a window that looked out on the slow procession of the river, where papyrus boats drifted and waterfowl circled like thoughts. Morning rituals, slowly donatate for all her refinement, did not live in Pharaoh's court. She lived upstream in a wealthy house on the margins of the grander centers of power. Her family had served in priestly offices 2 generations back, and now she was left to tend to landholdings and maintain honor through elegance, reputation, and inherited taste. Each morning, her routine unfolded like a ceremony. First, the oils, sweet myrrh and lily, then a paste of galena ground into coal for the eyes, bracelets of blue pharaohs, necklaces of carnelian, linen robes lightly starched with barley water, scented with lemon balm, but none of it began without the mirror. Teot would look into it, not to admire herself, though she had once been beautiful, but to remember who she was, who she had been, and the line of women who came before her. Her mother, her grandmother, even the imagined ancestor who might have worn a leopard skin shawl and sung lullabies beside a Nubian fire. Mirrors, she believed, were not just for faces, they were for stories. Crossroads of beauty and trade, the mirror, like Teot herself, belonged to a network much wider than one house on the Nile. Luxury goods in ancient Egypt often carried the signatures of faraway lands. Ivory from Kush, incense from Punt, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, glass from the Levant. These items moved slowly, exchanged not in haste, but over months, sometimes years, across caravans and barges, through marketplaces and diplomatic gifts. A mirror from Kush was not just an object, it was a symbol of alliance, of memory, of status earned through proximity to the wide world. And it shaped even the way a woman like Tayot saw herself. Her beauty was not just hers, was informed by the materials she used to mark it. The faint rose blush she rubbed onto her cheeks, ground petals from distant hills, the gold band around her finger, traded from Nubia, washed by hands she would never meet. Even her reflection was foreign-born. Stories passed like perfumers, the sun rose higher, the dressing rituals neared their end. Ta yet leaned back slightly, satisfied with the calm perfection of the morning. Her mirror was laid carefully back in its pouch. The servants moved silently again, folding linens, adjusting drapery, refilling the little dishes of pigment. Meru stayed close, brushing imaginary dust from the low windowsill. "Will you tell me again," she asked softly, "how the trader brought it to you?" Tayot turned her eyes toward the open sky. "Someday," she said, "you'll have a mirror of your own, maybe from the east, or the great north where the snow never melts. You'll tell your own story then, but it won't be this one." "No," Tayot agreed. "It won't be this one." And outside, the Nile slid past, slow as a polished word, while the scent of beeswax and myrrh curled like memory through the quiet room. The late afternoon sun angled through the narrow slit windows of the house of Lifer, quiet chamber in the temple compound where scrolls and ink waited patiently, far more patient than the humans who served them. The air inside was still, like a held breath, scented with old papyrus, faint oils from scribes' skin, and the subtle ghost of temple incense that wafted in from the distant sanctum. Outside, the Nile whispered against its banks, but inside, silence reigned, broken only by the soft scratch of reed pens and the occasional murmur of a yawn. In one corner of the room, half slumped over a linen-wrapped stack of writing boards, was a very tired apprentice. His name was Nebu. His friends said he looked like a cat caught between curiosity and sleep, all big eyes and slouching limbs. He had been up since well before dawn, helping mix inks, fetching water for steam baths, sorting broken pens, and scrubbing the reed mats beneath the elder scribes' seats. But now, past the heat of midday, Nebu's task had slowed to something both sacred and sleepy, copying love spells onto a set of practice scrolls. His pen, dark with soot ink, hovered over the curled line of a half-finished spell. "If the one you love does not speak your name by morning, burn this papyrus beneath." 3 lotus petals, ... And then, nothing. His hand dropped, his head dipped. A long breath escaped his nose as dreams crept quietly through the shadows of the scroll. It wasn't that the spell was boring. In fact, Nebu found these spells quite lovely, even romantic, in a quiet sort of way. Some were straightforward, offering names and herbs, instructions and timing. Others were pure poetry, tangled in metaphors, comparing a lover's gaze to the moon's reflection in water, or a single kiss to the sudden blooming of a water lily. What caught Nebu's heart in particular was a line from an older spell he'd copied days earlier. "May my name float into your ear like the sound of a flute down the river." He thought about that line often. He didn't know who had first written it, some priest scribe hundreds of years ago. A clever girl with a sense of humor and a fondness for flutes. Whoever it was, their words now lived in the ink on his practice scrolls, even as he dozed among them. Outside the chamber, the Nile slipped past, slow and knowing. Love spells, you see, were not only for the rich, they were tucked into the lives of servants and potters and fishmongers. Sometimes scribes were paid to write them by widows trying to remarry, or by young men with too much nervous energy. But more often, the spells were quietly copied, for practice never burned, never used, simply written and rewritten like gentle echoes of longing. The ones Nebu was working on had been chosen by his teacher, Master Hori, who claimed the best. Scribes understood the rhythm of the human heart before they tried to write tax ledgers or grain counts. The Nile doesn't just feed bodies, Hori said once, it feeds dreams. Copy enough of those dreams, and you learn how people really live. And so Nebu wrote. But on this particular day, the soft golden light of late afternoon had conspired with the rhythmic rustling of papyrus and the warm, predictable hum of the temple walls to lull him into a peaceful nap. His pen had left a faint trail on the scroll where it slid down. His mouth was slightly open. He dreamed of lotus petals drifting across water. In his dream, he was no longer a tired scribe. He was standing on the riverbank, dressed in bright linen, holding a scroll that shimmered in the sunlight. Across the river, someone was laughing, a girl with hair like woven dusk and a voice like temple bells. She held a bronze mirror in one hand, catching the sun, sending its reflection dancing across the water. Each glint of light landed on Nebu's chest like a heartbeat. He opened the scroll. The words inside glowed faintly. Speak my name to the river. If it answers, I will find you. But he couldn't remember her name. The river responded anyway. It whispered softly, as it always had. When Nebi woke, the room was darkening. The windows no longer spilled light, but invited in the first sense of evening, the faint wet smell of stone cooling down, the touch of the river's breath. Lamps had been lit elsewhere in the temple, their flickering glow slipping like lazy fireflies across walls and mats. He sat up, blinking. The scroll was still beneath his hand. The ink hadn't smeared miraculously. His pen had rolled a short distance and lay still, like it too had taken a nap. Nebu picked it up slowly. His fingers bore faint stains of soot and ochre-red dot from the back of the room. A quiet voice murmured, "Did she speak your name?" Nebu turned. It was Master Hori. The old man was seated against the wall, his long legs stretched out like an unrolled scroll, arms crossed. He looked amused. I don't think so," Nebu stammered. Hori chuckled. "Then keep writing. Even love spells take practice." That night, as the temple hushed for evening offerings and the great doors groaned softly closed, Nebu stayed behind in the scribe's chamber. He relit the lamp nearest his scroll. The world was quiet, again no clamor of priests, no shuffle of feet, only the steady sound of reed pen against papyrus and the occasional chirp from a gecko in the ceiling beam. He picked up the line where he had left off. ... Burn this papyrus beneath 3 lotus petals. Then, just below that, he added something not in the original. And if she dreams of me, let the Nile carry her laughter back. He smiled at the thought. Somewhere, perhaps, someone had already written it before. Maybe centuries ago. Maybe just yesterday, in the quiet corners of Egypt's temples. Love didn't always need spells. Sometimes, all it needed was a sleepy apprentice, a bit of ink, and a river that remembered everything. The Nile does not sleep, not really. Even when the wind quiets, even when no feet tread its banks, the water keeps breathing, slow and deep like the chest of a slumbering god. In the final hush of night, the river becomes a mirror, and the moon, pale and full, leans in to look at herself. On this still night, frogs croak in lazy chorus. Somewhere out in the reeds, a heron shifts its weight. Palm trees whisper with the faintest breeze, and the stars above blink slowly, like old men who are too tired to stay fully awake. There is no one speaking on the banks just now, but the river has a way of remembering. Somewhere in its ancient curves, someone has always watched this same moonlight stretch across the current. Always, someone has paused to listen. Tonight, a boy lies flat on a woven mat outside his family's hut, cheek pressed to his arm. He is not really meant to be out here. His mother would have told him to go back inside to avoid mosquitoes, to stay warm, to not bother the owls. But he couldn't sleep. The house was too full of stories. His uncle was visiting again, and had brought tales of crocodiles with gold teeth, and a woman who danced so beautifully that a prince drowned chasing her reflection in a wine bowl. So he came outside and let the stories drift out of his head like smoke. Now only the sky remains. He watches the river, its surface trembling gently with moonlight. It looks like silver silk, tonight drawn slowly by invisible fingers, never folding, never tearing. A frog croaks near his elbow. Another answers, further. Down the bank, somewhere across the water, a hyena laughs. But it is a sleepy, half-hearted laugh, more breath than sound. In the shallows, lotus flowers nod on their long stems. Dragonflies rest, wings closed, on the curved edges of reeds. A water beetle draws a perfect line across the surface, and it ripples outward as if time itself had blinked. The boy doesn't know what he's waiting for. He just feels that the river is about to say something. Not in words, never in words, but something will hum through the earth and rise up into his bones. He closes his eyes. Just for a moment, the Nile has heard prayers and screams. It has seen lovers kiss in the reeds and bodies buried in the silt. It has carried perfume and linen, scrolls and gold, children and papyrus rafts tied with hope. It has washed temples and forgotten fishermen alike. The river remembers them all, and yet tonight it says nothing too grand. Only this, hush, be still. The boy hears it. So did a girl centuries ago, who once dropped her sandals and danced barefoot by the bank while waiting for her betrothed to return. So did a dying farmer who asked to be carried outside so he could hear the frogs one last time. So did a queen who, after all her court had gone to bed, stood by her carved balcony and whispered her childhood name to the river, just to see if it would answer. It always did. It still does. The river sings, not with music, but with peace, with breath, with the weight of 1,000 quiet lives spent listening to moonlight and frog song and the rustle of wind in reeds. It is not the gold that makes the Nile a jewel, not the temples, not the scrolls, not the gods carved into stone. The treasure lies here in this endless, sleeping rhythm, in a stillness so complete that the stars lean closer, trying to hear. The boy dreams now. He dreams of boats made of clouds and nets that catch fireflies. He dreams of old stories stitched into the sky. He dreams of the Nile, not as a river, but as a friend who hums lullabies with the patience of centuries, and the moon listens to full and quiet, as the river sings to her once more.